They called them the walking wounded, soldiers who breathed a strange gas, smelled fresh hay, and felt completely fine. They walked back to their trenches. They wrote letters home. Some laughed at how the war had briefly smelled like a summer meadow. 12 hours later, they drowned in their own body's fluids while fully conscious, because the gas had been silently dismantling the membranes of their lungs the entire time. The gas was Phosgene. In the First World War, it killed 100,000 men this way, not with burning pain or visible wounds, but with a pastoral sweetness that told the brain everything was safe while the body destroyed itself from the inside. And Phosgene never went away. It migrated from artillery shells into dye factories, plastic plants, and the foam inside your car seats. It is still manufactured by the million-ton today, still smelling like fresh hay, still capable of the exact same delayed damage. You have left the surface. The hatch seals above you. The light narrows to a beam. Below are the files. John Davy's glass tube in 1812, when a young chemist inhaled the vapor and wrote one word: pleasant. The dye vats of Ludwigshafen, where workers breathed the gas for 12 hours a day and called it the smell of honest work. The 1927 British study stamped "no funds available." That proved the lung damage never stopped. And box 247 inches, the National Archives, where the evidence has been waiting for nearly a century. This is the Deep Archive. The descent begins now. The man who woke up drowning at 2 a.m. had spent the day tightening valves on a Phosgene storage tank. He did not know the word Phosgene. He knew the smell, a sweet, grassy sweetness that came and went with the wind, that made the factory floor feel like a meadow in June, that the older hands called the hay and joked about over their lunch pails. He had finished his shift at 6, eaten dinner with his wife, played with his children, and gone to bed feeling tired but otherwise fine. Then, somewhere around the second hour of deep sleep, the pressure began to build inside his chest. It was not pain. It was a tightening, a gradual closing, as if a hand were pressing on his sternum from the inside. He sat up in the dark, gasping, his hands flat on the mattress, his lungs pulling against something that would not open. The room smelled of nothing unusual, the ordinary darkness of a bedroom in Ludwigshafen in 1899, coal smoke from the stove, the faint starch of laundered sheets. But his lungs were filling with a fluid he could not see, a slow leak across membranes that had been chemically broken 12 hours earlier, while he was laughing at a joke about the hay. His name was Carl Reuter. The language to describe what was happening inside his lungs did not yet exist in the vocabulary of medicine. The doctor who examined him had never heard the word Phosgene applied to a living patient. John Davy was 22 when he first met the same gas, in a glass tube no larger than a fountain pen, on a July morning in 1812. The room was in Bristol, England, a borrowed laboratory near a sash window that let in the summer sun. He had filled the tube with carbon monoxide and chlorine, two gases well known to the chemists of his day, and he had watched for hours as nothing happened. Then the sun came out. The mixture paled. A new compound condensed on the inner wall of the tube, a colorless liquid that evaporated instantly when he cracked the seal. The smell that reached his nostrils was so unexpected that he wrote it down immediately, as if the observation might disappear. A pleasant smell, somewhat like that of new hay. John Davy was not a famous man. He was the younger brother of Sir Humphrey Davy, the celebrated chemist who had isolated sodium and potassium, who moved through the Royal Society like a natural force. John had inherited the scientific aptitude, but not the public glory. He spent his career in the quieter corners of the profession: army hospitals, colonial postings, laboratory benches that belonged to other men. On that July morning, he was not attempting to change the world. He was exploring the photochemistry of gases, the way light could nudge molecules into new arrangements, and he had no reason to suspect that the reaction he was documenting would outlive him by 2 centuries and claim more human lives than any other chemical weapon ever devised. The paper he published that year in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society was brief. It catalogued the conditions under which phosgene formed, the proportions of the reactants, the physical properties of the product. He noted that the gas was heavier than air, that it dissolved in water, that it decomposed slowly when heated. He did not mention toxicity because he had no reason to suspect it. He had inhaled a trace amount when he opened the tube, and he had felt nothing beyond a brief sweetness and a faint irritation in his throat that passed within minutes. The experiment was a footnote in the explosion of synthetic chemistry sweeping through Europe, and John Davy moved on to other projects: the chemistry of volcanic soils, the properties of coral, the medical uses of chlorine. He gave the new compound a name that honored its origin: phosgene, from the Greek phos, meaning light, and genon, to generate. Born from light. The name was elegant, precise, and innocent. It carried no warning, because he had no warning to give. But the paradox was already present in that first encounter, coiled inside the description like a spring. A gas born from sunlight, named for light, associated with the most pastoral of fragrances, and yet its mechanism was one of quiet devastation, a way of damaging the human lung that would not announce itself for hours or days after exposure. The smell was the deception. Fresh hay is the scent of safety to anyone who has walked through a field in late summer. The odor of dried grass and clover, of agricultural work and rural memory. It does not burn the eyes or catch the throat the way chlorine does. It arrives as a gentle note, almost nostalgic, and the body's instinct is to breathe deeper, to place the memory, to relax into the association. That instinct would become lethal. John Davy had stumbled upon a chemical that used human psychology as part of its delivery system, a molecule that arrived wrapped in the fragrance of innocence. He wrote it down as pleasant and moved on to other things, because the 19th century had not yet invented the framework that would make his observation legible as a warning. The room where the synthesis took place no longer exists. The building was demolished sometime in the 19th century, replaced by newer construction that was itself replaced, and if you stand at the approximate coordinates today, you are likely to be in a coffee shop or a retail store. When John Davy sealed his notes and washed his glassware, the last traces of phosgene dissipated through the open window and settled into the street below, where it mixed with the ordinary odors of a port city: salt water, horse manure, coal fires, bread baking, and became indistinguishable from the background of everyday life. The hay smell was gone within minutes. The knowledge remained, inert, waiting for a century to pass, and a war to begin, and an industry to discover that the pleasant gas could be manufactured by the ton. John Davy never learned what phosgene could do. He never saw the dye vats of Ludwigshafen or the field hospitals where men coughed up pink froth 24 hours after a gas attack. He lived to 78, a respected but minor figure. and his contribution to the story was complete. Before the story began, he had given the gas its name, its smell, its chemical description, and its place in the literature. And then he had walked away, leaving the molecule to wait in the archive of known compounds. But the molecule was not waiting quietly. It was already being produced by the ton in reactors that John Davy could not have imagined, in factories that had discovered the economic value of the gas. And the men who worked in those factories were beginning to notice something that the scientific literature had not yet named. In the winter of 1887, a shift foreman at the BASF dye works in Ludwigshafen noticed that his chest felt tight about 4 hours after he left the plant. The sensation was subtle, a band of pressure across the sternum, nothing painful enough to stop him from eating dinner or kissing his children goodnight. By morning, the tightness would fade. He mentioned it to a company physician who listened to his lungs through a wooden stethoscope and heard nothing unusual. The doctor prescribed a camphor poultice and told him the workshop air was simply dry. The foreman kept working. The tightness returned 3 times a week for the next 2 years, a rhythm so regular that he stopped noticing it, the way a man stops hearing his own heartbeat. His name was Carl Reuter, and by 1899, his lungs were so scarred that he could no longer climb the stairs to his own apartment. The tightness never left him. The doctors had no framework for a poison that took 12 hours to announce itself, no vocabulary for a chemical that smelled like summer and killed like winter. The gap between John Davy's observation, pleasant smell, and Carl Reuter's ruined lungs, chronic bronchitis, is the distance between discovery and understanding. It is a distance that can span a century when the evidence is filed in the wrong cabinet, when the symptoms look like other diseases, when the smell of a substance does not match the danger it carries. The hay fragrance was not a warning, it was a disguise. And the disguise was so effective that it took a world war to see through it. But by the time the war began, the factories were already built, the gas was already flowing, and the chemistry that would kill 100,000 soldiers had been perfected in the pursuit of a different kind of achievement altogether. The reactors that made the color for the trousers of American farmers were about to be turned toward a purpose that no one had yet admitted out loud. The corridor at the BASF plant in Ludwigshafen ran 300 feet from the reactor hall to the dye vats, and it smelled of sweet grass in every season. The men who walked it wore canvas aprons stiff with chemical residue, and they breathed the odor for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Some of them joked that it made the factory feel like a meadow in June. None of them understood that the hay scent was a gas called Phosgene, leaking in trace amounts from valves and seals, settling into their lungs without a single cough to mark its arrival. The factory had not been built to make poison, it had been built to make color. By the 1880s, BASF had become one of the largest chemical works in Europe, a sprawling campus of iron and brick on the Rhine River, devoted to turning coal tar into dye. Coal tar was the black, viscous waste of coke ovens and gasworks, a substance that most industries paid to have hauled away. German chemists had learned to crack it open, extracting the aromatic building blocks of a new synthetic world, the precursors not only of indigo, but of the explosives that would level the Western Front and the anesthetics that would put soldiers under the knife. But in the 1880s, no one was thinking about war. They were thinking about color. From these came dyes that did not fade in sunlight, pigments that cost a fraction of their natural counterparts, and a quiet industrial revolution that would reconfigure the global textile trade within a single generation. The prize that obsessed them was indigo. Natural indigo came from plantations in Bengal and the West Indies, extracted from the leaves of indigofera plants through a labor-intensive process of fermentation and oxidation. The British Empire controlled much of the supply, and the price fluctuated with monsoons, labor unrest, and the whims of colonial administrators. A synthetic indigo, a blue as deep as the sky, stable in the wash, and cheap enough to mass produce, would not merely be a scientific triumph. It would redraw the economic map. It would clothe the working classes of America and Europe in a color that had once been a luxury. And it required phosgene. The gas that John Davy had described as pleasant turned out to be an extraordinary chemical tool. Its structure was simple and perfectly suited for the task. It functioned as a molecular seamstress, stitching together organic molecules with a precision that other reagents could not match. In the production of indigo and its related dyes, phosgene was the essential intermediate, the invisible hand that connected the precursor compounds into the deep blue that the market demanded. By 1890, phosgene was no longer a laboratory curiosity. It was a commodity, manufactured by the ton in dedicated reactors at Ludwigshafen, fed through copper pipes into vessels the size of railway carriages, where it combined with aniline derivatives to produce the rich blues that would transform the textile industry. The shift was not gradual. It was a decisive pivot in the material world. In 1882, a pair of blue work pants cost an American laborer the equivalent of a full day's wages if they were dyed with natural indigo. By 1902, after German synthetic indigo flooded the market, the price had fallen to pocket change. The blue of the working class, the blue of railroad engineers and meatpackers and dock workers and cotton pickers, was a German blue, born in a reactor that breathed phosgene. The indigo plantations of Bengal, which had employed hundreds of thousands of workers under conditions that were often brutal, collapsed within a decade. The American housewife who bought a set of blue cotton curtains from a Sears Roebuck catalog in 1905 had no idea that the color in her parlor window traced back to a gas that smelled like cut hay, manufactured in a factory on the Rhine by men who coughed quietly into their sleeves at the end of every shift. The men who ran the phosgene reactors worked in heat and noise that had its own physical weight. The reactor hall at Ludwigshafen was a cathedral of riveted iron, its ceiling lost in steam and shadow, its floor wet with condensation that ate through leather boot soles in a matter of months. The reactors themselves were enormous cylinders, painted with black enamel that blistered and peeled after weeks of contact with corrosive precursors. Brass valves protruded from flanges and elbows, each one dripping a pale yellowish condensate that evaporated into the air before it could reach the floor. The workers adjusted these valves with wrenches wrapped in oilcloth, checking pressure gauges whose needles trembled in the yellow light of gas lamps. The hay smell was always present, sometimes faint, sometimes strong enough to coat the tongue. When a new man asked about it, the older hand said it was only the chemicals. Nothing to worry about. You got used to it. And color was only the beginning. By 1900, phosgene had slipped into the supply chains of 3 other industries, none of which advertised its presence. The new synthetic leather that upholstered the seats of streetcars and early automobiles required phosgene to produce the polyurethane coatings that gave it sheen and durability. The early plastics used phosgene in their synthesis, a fact that no manufacturer mentioned in its catalogs. And in the operating theaters of Europe and America, anesthetics whose synthesis relied on phosgene as an intermediate were putting patients into deep, dreamless sleep while surgeons opened their abdomens and chests. The BASF plant at Ludwigshafen, and others like it in Herbst and Leverkusen, became a kind of nervous system for this new material world. The Phosgene they produced traveled in iron cylinders on flatbed rail cars, crossing the borders of the German states, then Europe, then the Atlantic. It arrived at factories in New Jersey and Manchester and Milan and St. Petersburg, where it was combined with other chemicals to make products that felt entirely innocent. A pair of brown leather gloves, a mahogany automobile dashboard, a brown glass bottle of anesthetic. The supply chain was efficient, opaque, and largely unregulated. No law required a dye factory to label its Phosgene shipments with warnings. No treaty restricted the trade of chemical intermediates. The gas moved through the world with the ease of a rumor, appearing where it was needed and disappearing into the finished product without leaving a signature. The workers who handled it at the far ends of that supply chain fared no better than the ones at the source. In a small synthetic leather plant in Newark, New Jersey, a 1902 company logbook recorded that 3 men in the coating department had been reassigned to lighter duties after complaining of shortness of breath and a feeling of smothering that came on several hours after their shifts ended. The logbook did not speculate on the cause. It simply noted the reassignments and moved on to the next week's production targets. At the source itself, in Ludwigshafen, the same story had already reached its end for a man named Karl Reuter. He had tightened valves in the reactor hall for 19 years, breathing the hay-scented air shift after shift until his lungs could no longer sustain even the ordinary climb up a flight of stairs. He died at home in 1902 at the age of 47. The death certificate listed chronic bronchitis. The word Phosgene appeared nowhere on it because the language to describe what the dye works had done to its workers had not yet been invented, or perhaps no one had wanted to invent it. The German chemical industry, meanwhile, had become the envy of the world. Its factories were models of efficiency, its chemists the best trained, its patent libraries the most comprehensive. The knowledge that made synthetic dyes possible was precisely the same knowledge that could, with almost no modification, scale up the production of poison gas. The reactors that fed the textile mills could feed the artillery shell. The logistics network that shipped indigo to London and New York could ship Phosgene to the front. The German military had taken note of the chemical industry's potential as early as the 1890s. Quiet conversations had been held in government offices about the strategic value of a gas that could incapacitate without immediate warning. Those conversations did not appear in any published record. They were conducted in the same tone that a banker uses to discuss a contingency fund: prudent, measured, hypothetical. No one in 1900 could have predicted the exact shape of the war to come, but the elements were already in place. The industrial plant, the chemical expertise, the massive stockpiles of Phosgene maintained for the legitimate demands of the dye and plastics and pharmaceutical trades, and the smell of fresh hay drifting through factory corridors day after day, year after year, settling into the lungs of workers who had no reason to fear it, training a generation of chemists to think of Phosgene as a useful tool rather than a weapon. The strange part was not that Phosgene became a weapon. The strange part was that it took so long for anyone to notice that it already was one. The only difference between the factory floor and the trench was the concentration and the paperwork. The gas did not change its nature when the shipping manifest was rewritten. It remained what it had always been, a colorless vapor with a summer smell, a molecule of perfect industrial manners and patient harm. The afternoon when that moment arrived would be an ordinary one in Ludwigshafen. The reactors would still be running. The hay smell would still hang in the corridors. The men in canvas aprons would still be adjusting the brass valves, wiping condensation from their faces with the backs of their hands. But somewhere in a government office in Berlin, a clerk would stamp a requisition order, and the Phosgene that had colored the trousers of American farmers would be routed into steel cylinders marked with a different destination. The factory would not need to be rebuilt. The chemistry would not need to be reinvented. The only change would be a few lines on a shipping document. And the smell of new mown hay, so long a background note in the lives of dye workers, would become the last thing a soldier smelled before his lungs began to fill with fluid he could not feel. Hours after the cloud had passed, when he was already back in his trench, laughing at his own luck, a snow-covered artillery range outside Cologne, December 1914. The greenish cylinders lay on their sides near a row of hay bales arranged to simulate field fortifications, their brass fittings clouded with frost, their painted markings, industrial codes from the BASF dye works, visible only if you knelt close enough to read them. A dozen men in leather and rubber gas masks moved slowly through the frozen stubble, their breath condensing inside the eyepieces, making it difficult to see the stopwatches clipped to their coats. At the center of the range, standing beside a tripod-mounted anemometer, Fritz Haber checked his pocket watch and waited for the wind to shift. Haber was 46 years old, a converted Jew who had risen to the directorship of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry through sheer intellectual force. He was already famous for solving one of the central problems of human civilization. The Haber-Bosch process, developed with Carl Bosch at BASF, pulled nitrogen from the air and fixed it into ammonia, synthetic fertilizer that had broken Europe's dependence on imported Chilean nitrates and made it possible to feed millions who would otherwise have starved. By 1914, the process was producing over 1 million tons of ammonia annually, sustaining German agriculture and, crucially, manufacturing the nitric acid required for high explosives. The same industrial chemistry that nourished the soil also armed the artillery, and Haber saw no meaningful distinction between these applications. Chemistry was chemistry. A bond was a bond. The hay bales on the Wan Range that afternoon had been placed to test something Haber had been thinking about since the war began 4 months earlier. The German offensive had stalled in the trenches. The Western Front was frozen into a siege that conventional artillery could not break. Haber believed chemistry could break it, and he had been systematically evaluating industrial compounds from the dye works for their military utility. The logic was straightforward. Germany possessed the world's most advanced chemical infrastructure, a network of factories, pipelines, storage tanks, and trained chemists that no other nation could match. His team had already tested Phosgene on laboratory animals at the institute. Dogs exposed to low concentrations showed almost no immediate distress. They breathed normally. They wagged their tails at familiar handlers. 6 hours later, they began to cough. 12 hours later, their respiratory rates climbed from 20 breaths per minute to 60, then 80. As fluid accumulated in the alveolar spaces where oxygen was supposed to diffuse into blood, the animals did not panic. They simply grew quiet, their breathing increasingly shallow and wet, until the fluid volume exceeded the lungs' capacity for gas exchange, and they drowned on dry ground. The mechanism was physiological, not psychological. The same silent alveolar destruction that field surgeons would later document at Ypres, where men walked into the ward, breathing, and were carried out hours later with lungs full of fluid they could not feel accumulating. What Haber understood immediately was the tactical implication. Chlorine announced itself with immediate pain, forcing men to flee or don masks. Phosgene was polite. It waited. It let the soldier believe he had survived, which meant he would not seek treatment, would not be evacuated, would remain in position until his lungs filled and he collapsed. From a tactical perspective, this was not cruelty. It was efficiency. The field trials at Juan measured how long that efficiency lasted under winter conditions. Haber's assistants released measured quantities of phosgene from the cylinders and timed its dispersion across the snow-covered range, noting how the cold air slowed the gas's diffusion, how it settled into shell craters and shallow depressions, how the hay-sweet odor lingered at detectable concentrations for up to 45 minutes in sheltered terrain. The men in gas masks moved through the test area at timed intervals, collecting air samples in glass tubes. Haber recorded the numbers in a small leather notebook, his handwriting careful and unhurried. The temperature was -4 degrees Celsius. The wind was from the northwest at 3 meters per second. The gas cloud remained concentrated and close to the ground, as he had predicted. What made these trials possible, what made the entire German chemical weapons program possible, was an industrial fact that required almost no moral transformation to become a military one. The BASF plant had been manufacturing phosgene by the ton since the 1890s. The reactors were already built. The storage tanks were already filled. The chemists and shift supervisors already knew how to handle the gas, how to cool it, how to move it through pipes and into pressurized cylinders. Converting a dye factory to a chemical weapons plant required, in practical terms, little more than signing different shipping manifests. The phosgene that had been destined for a textile mill in Manchester would now be routed to an artillery depot outside Ypres. The same cylinder, the same brass valve, the same faint greenish-yellow vapor. By the end of December 1914, Haber had established the parameters. Phosgene shells could be manufactured using existing industrial capacity. The gas would persist long enough to saturate enemy positions. Its delayed physiological effects made it tactically superior to any existing chemical agent. He submitted his findings to the German High Command as a production schedule, complete with delivery dates and deployment recommendations. The generals read the report. Some of them found the idea of poison gas distasteful, a violation of the Hague Conventions. But the trench lines were frozen solid and the casualty lists were growing longer every week, and honor had not yet found a way to break through barbed wire. The archive preserves a quieter document from those December weeks, a letter Haber wrote to his wife, Clara Immerwahr, herself a chemist of formidable training who had given up her own research career to support his. The letter does not mention the Juan trials. It describes the weather, the food at the officers' mess, the difficulty of obtaining decent tobacco. It is a perfectly ordinary letter from a husband to a wife, and its ordinariness is the most disturbing thing about it. Clara Immerwahr had been one of the first women to earn a doctorate in chemistry in Germany. She had married Haber in 1901, converted to Christianity with him, and watched as his career consumed everything: his time, his attention, the space in their home that might have held her own research. She understood the chemistry of his work as few others could. She knew what phosgene did to lung tissue. She knew that the same intellectual apparatus that had solved the nitrogen problem was now being turned toward a different kind of optimization. 5 months later, Clara would take her husband's service revolver into the garden of their Berlin home and shoot herself through the heart. She left no note. The biographers have argued ever since about whether her death was a protest against the gaswork, but the absence of a note is itself a kind of statement. She had been erased so thoroughly that she did not believe her final act would be understood. She died before the first major Phosgene attack, before anyone in the world knew what the smell of fresh hay could mean in the wrong context, before the gas that had seemed like a tactical innovation became a permanent feature of modern warfare. The morning after her death, Fritz Haber left for the Eastern Front to oversee a gas attack against Russian positions. He did not attend her funeral. The cylinders from the Wan Range were refilled, relabeled, and shipped west. The stopwatch data was compiled into firing tables for artillery officers. The hay bales were left to rot in the snow, their purpose served. Their scent indistinguishable from the gas that would soon drift across no man's land, carrying the fragrance of a German summer meadow into the lungs of men who had never heard the word Phosgene and would not live long enough to learn it. The cloud began as a pressure reading. A slight drop on a brass gauge bolted to an iron cylinder half buried in the Flanders clay. It was a little after 2:00 a.m. On May 19, 1915, moonless, the sky so thoroughly black that the men who opened the valves could not see their own hands. They worked by touch, turning the wrench 1/4 turn at a time, and the only proof that anything was leaving the cylinders was a low, continuous hiss that might have been wind pressing through dead grass, except that there was no wind. Along a 3-mile front north of Ypres, 4,000 cylinders released 168 tons of phosgene gas into the night. The cloud was colorless, heavier than air, and it moved with a patience that was almost geological, settling into shell craters and old trench lines, filling the low places first, exactly as Fritz Haber had calculated at the Wan artillery range 6 months earlier. The calculations said the cloud would reach the French and British forward positions in 7 minutes. The calculations said nothing about what the men would smell. They smelled fresh-cut hay. Private William Brock, a signals clerk with the 2nd Battalion of the East Surrey Regiment, noticed it in the middle of a letter he was writing to his mother. His pencil stopped. He lifted his head and sniffed. The trench smelled of wet wool, chloride of lime from the latrine buckets, the faint brine of tinned beef, and now, incongruously, hay, sweet, almost floral, the kind of smell that belonged to August afternoons in Kent, not to a forward listening post in the small hours of a spring morning. Brock made a joke to the man next to him about someone cutting grass behind the lines at 2 in the morning. The man laughed. Neither of them reached for a gas mask. The masks were primitive things, uncomfortable enough that men removed them whenever the immediate danger seemed past. And this did not seem like danger. It seemed like a mistake, like some quartermaster's shipment of hay had been hit by a shell and the wind had carried the smell forward. This was the difference that Haber had counted on. Chlorine, which the Germans had released at Ypres a month earlier, announced itself with a color visible even in dim light and with immediate violent irritation. Chlorine stripped the throat, burned the eyes, and forced men to flee or mask. Phosgene was something else entirely. The molecule, Coclel-2, a single carbon atom flanked by an oxygen and 2 chlorines, was small enough to slip past the upper airways and settle deep in the alveolar sacs, where the blood takes up oxygen from the air. It did not burn the eyes. It did not trigger a coughing fit. It did not trigger any reflex that told the body to get out. The only sensation was a faint sweetness on the tongue, the memory of a summer field, and then nothing. Inside the lung, the molecule began its quiet work. It underwent hydrolysis, stripping chlorine from carbon and leaving behind hydrochloric acid in minute quantities. But that was not the real damage. The carbonyl group that remained, the carbon and oxygen together, was an acylating agent. It reached for the proteins that held the alveolar capillary membrane together, the delicate barrier less than a micron thick across which oxygen diffuses into blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out. It bound to those proteins, changed their shape, disrupted their function. The membrane began to leak, not all at once, slowly, patiently, molecule by molecule, hour by hour. The body's own architecture was being undone by a chemical that had, in its first moments, smelled like a summer field. And for the first 6 hours, sometimes 12, sometimes 24, the man who had inhaled the hay-sweetened air felt almost nothing. A slight tightness in the chest maybe, a dry throat, nothing that could not be blamed on exhaustion or the ordinary misery of life in the line. The French and British soldiers who survived the initial cloud did what soldiers do after an attack. They counted themselves lucky, resumed their posts, and got on with the war. Some lit cigarettes, some finished letters. Private Brock went back to his message forms. The German observation posts, watching through artillery scopes, noted with clinical curiosity that the enemy lines had not erupted in panic. There were no screams, no stampedes, no men writhing on the ground. The cloud had done its work invisibly. The first deaths began at dawn, around 6:00 a.m., 4 hours after the cylinders were opened. A French colonial soldier in an advanced trench sat up from a light doze, coughed twice, and collapsed forward with a sound that his comrades described as a wet rattle. Within the hour, a dozen more men in the same sector developed the same symptoms: rapid, shallow breathing, a gray-blue tint to the lips and fingernails, a cough that produced a pink froth they could not swallow away. The regimental aid post filled with men who looked, in the first confused moments, more drunk than poisoned. They were lucid, frightened, but not screaming, and the doctor on duty could do nothing but sit with them, note the rising pulse, the falling blood pressure, and wait. Oxygen was a theoretical treatment. There was no oxygen to give. Morphine eased the panic, but did nothing to stop the lungs from filling. By noon, the burial parties had begun their work, and the number of dead stood at well over 100. By the end of the second day, approximately 800 men were dead from pulmonary edema caused by Phosgene, and the doctors were only beginning to understand that the deaths had been set in motion by a gas that smelled like hay. By the time Private Brock began coughing, the cloud was long gone. He was evacuated to a field hospital near Popperingham, where he spent 3 days propped up on a cot, breathing in short, wet gasps, his face the color of old newsprint. He survived, which was unusual. Most of the men in his forward section did not. His medical officer wrote Phosgene poisoning, moderate on his chart, and added a note in the margin that the patient had complained of a persistent cough and tightness in the chest, even after the acute symptoms resolved. The note was filed. The war moved on. But that note pointed towards something the military doctors of 1915 were not equipped to recognize. The gas had done more than fill Brock's lungs with fluid. It had altered the architecture of the tissue itself, depositing scar proteins in the alveolar walls, stiffening the membranes, leaving behind a lung that could exchange gas at rest, but could not cope with exertion or infection or the ordinary insults of age. Phosgene had a second act waiting for the survivors, one that would not be diagnosed for decades, hidden inside the medical files of men who never stopped coughing, whose chests tightened every winter, who died of respiratory failure at 55 while their doctors wrote chronic bronchitis on the death certificates, and never connected a May night in Flanders to the slow drowning of a civilian lung in a peacetime bedroom. The physician who first documented this pattern was James C. Meekins, a thin man with ink-stained fingers who worked in the field hospitals and casualty clearing stations where the walking wounded kept arriving. His 1916 paper described the syndrome with chilling clarity. Men exposed to Phosgene passed through a latent period of anywhere from 6 to 24 hours. During that time, they were often euphoric. They felt well. They refused evacuation. They insisted on returning to their posts. Meekins noted, with the weary precision of a man who had watched too many of them die, that the walking wounded of chemical warfare were more dangerous to themselves than the visibly injured. A man with a shrapnel wound screamed, bled, demanded attention. A man with Phosgene in his lungs sat quietly, drank his tea, and told the orderly he was fine. The death rate from Phosgene was not immediate. Men died over days, not hours. A soldier exposed on Tuesday might walk back to his trench, eat his rations, joke with his mates, and be dead by Thursday evening. Another might collapse on Wednesday morning, be carried to the aid station, gasp for 2 days, and die on Friday. The forward hospitals learned to expect 2 waves of casualties from every gas attack. The first wave of chlorine victims, who arrived choking and blinded within minutes. And then, a day later, the second wave, the quiet men who had seemed perfectly fine. The second wave was larger. It was always larger. Over the course of the war, Phosgene would account for approximately 85% of all chemical weapons deaths. The total is contested. The records are incomplete. The chaos of the front consumed paperwork, but historians have placed the figure at around 100,000 men. 100,000 men who did not scream, did not blister, did not go blind. They simply fell silent, one after another, in disproportionately quiet hospital wards. And yet, when the First World War is remembered for its chemical weapons, the name that comes to mind is mustard gas. Mustard gas blistered skin and burned eyes and left scars that photographed well. Phosgene did not photograph. Its victims looked peaceful in death, their faces merely gray, as if the color had been slowly drained from them. At the casualty clearing station outside Poperinghe, a young pathologist named Greenfield weighed the organs of the dead to understand what had happened. He had no medical scale. He used a metal scale salvaged from the ruins of a nearby Belgian farmhouse, a scale intended for measuring flour. When he set the lungs of the gassed men upon it, the needle spun past 1 kilogram, then 2. The scale had learned to register the true, invisible weight of a new kind of warfare. When the war ended in November 1918, the world promised, in treaties and declarations, that Phosgene would never be used against soldiers again. The chemical weapons conventions were still decades in the future, but the sentiment was clear. The gas that smelled like hay was a relic of a war no one wanted to repeat. But the chemical giants knew something the treaties did not say. The molecule did not need to be destroyed. It only needed to be moved from the artillery shell into the American home. The pipes were still there. The storage tanks were still there. The rail cars loaded with Phosgene were still moving through American towns. The workers who had made the gas for the war went back to making it for industry, and the foremen still joked about the smell of fresh hay. The archive of Phosgene was not closed with the armistice. It was simply transferred from the War Office to the civilian economy, where it sat, unread, waiting for the next wave of men who would breathe it and feel nothing until their lungs began to fill. The men who ate lunch beside the storage tank did not call it Phosgene. They called it the sweet stuff, or hay gas, or sometimes nothing at all. Just another smell in a factory that had 100 smells, most of them worse. The tank was painted a pale green that had begun to flake in the summer of 1932, revealing patches of rust the color of dried blood, and it sat about 40 feet from the wooden picnic tables where the day shift took their noon break. The foreman, a man named Harold Krieger, who had been with DuPont since the deepwater plant opened, liked to tell new hires that the gas kept the mosquitoes away. He had been saying it for years. No one had ever questioned the logic, and no one had ever asked whether a substance that killed insects at trace concentrations might also be doing something to the men who inhaled it every working day. The deepwater plant stretched across 1,200 acres of New Jersey marshland, a landscape of cooling towers and pipe bridges and brick reactor buildings that had risen from the reeds during the war to supply the American military with everything from smokeless powder to the precursors of chemical weapons. When the armistice came in November 1918, the plant did not close. It pivoted. Within 18 months, the same reactors that had produced Phosgene for artillery shells were producing Phosgene for tetraethyl lead, the anti-knock compound that would make American gasoline smoother and more powerful. The conversion required almost no retooling. Phosgene was Phosgene. The molecule did not care whether it was bound for a shell or a fuel tank. This was the strange afterlife of the war's deadliest gas. It had been banned from the battlefield by treaties that everyone signed and nobody trusted, but it had never been banned from the factory floor. The chemical weapons conventions of the 1920s drew a bright line between military and civilian use, as if the same molecule behaved differently depending on who opened the valve. In international law, Phosgene was a forbidden weapon. In American industrial regulations, it was a chemical intermediate, no different from sulfuric acid or ammonia. The distinction was legal, not chemical. It existed on paper and nowhere else. IG Farben understood this earlier than anyone. The German conglomerate had been formed in 1925 from the merger of 6 chemical companies, including several that had manufactured Phosgene shells for the Kaiser's army. After the war, the Allies had imposed restrictions on German chemical weapons production, but the restrictions said nothing about synthetic rubber. They said nothing about the new artificial silk that was transforming the textile industry. They said nothing about polyurethane, which had been invented in 1937 and which required Phosgene as a building block for its isocyanate precursors. IG Farben's lawyers argued correctly, under the letter of the law, that Phosgene manufactured for civilian products was not the same thing as Phosgene manufactured for war. The reactors were the same, the pipes were the same, the workers breathed the same hay-scented air. But the shipping manifests carried different descriptions, and that, in the eyes of the law, was enough. In the United States, DuPont moved with similar speed. By 1925, the company was producing Phosgene at scale in deepwater, using it primarily to manufacture tetraethyl lead and a new synthetic leather called Fabricoid. Fabricoid was a marvel of industrial chemistry, a cellulose-based material coated with phosgene-derived compounds. It looked like leather, felt like leather, and cost a fraction of what real leather cost. It covered the seats of Model T Fords. It became the default upholstery for American automobiles, railroad cars, and furniture. Every American who sat down in a car during the 1920s and 1930s was resting on the products of phosgene chemistry, though almost none of them knew it. Because the smell of hay did not survive the manufacturing process, and DuPont's marketing materials said nothing about the gas that made the miracle possible. The workers knew something was wrong, but they lacked the vocabulary to describe it. At Deepwater, at the Union Carbide plant in South Charleston, at the Monsanto facility in St. Louis, the pattern was consistent. Men who worked in the phosgene buildings would finish their shifts feeling tired, but otherwise fine. They would go home, eat dinner, play with their children, and go to bed. In the early hours of the morning, they would wake up unable to breathe. The sensation was not pain exactly, more like a tightening, a gradual closing, as if something were slowly filling the spaces where air belonged. Their wives would call doctors. The doctors would listen to their chests, hear the wet crackling that indicated fluid in the lungs, and diagnose bronchitis, or pneumonia, or pleurisy. The word phosgene almost never appeared on a death certificate. The absence was not accidental. Factory physicians in the 1920s and 1930s worked for the company, not for the workers. When a worker died with fluid-filled lungs, the company doctor had every incentive to write bronchitis on the form, and every disincentive to launch an investigation into occupational exposure. A diagnosis of phosgene poisoning would have triggered questions about workplace safety, about ventilation, about the concentration of gas in the air around the storage tanks. It would have cost money. Bronchitis cost nothing. Bronchitis closed the file. By 1930, the numbers had become difficult to ignore, though most people still managed to ignore them. A study published in the Journal of Industrial Hygiene that year documented 47 cases of acute phosgene poisoning in American chemical plants over a 5-year period, with 12 fatalities. The study's authors noted that these were only the cases that had been officially reported, and that the true numbers were almost certainly higher. They recommended continuous monitoring of phosgene concentrations in factory air. None of the recommendations were implemented. The paradox was structural, not personal. No individual manager at DuPont or IG Farben woke up in the morning intending to poison workers. The decisions that led to exposure were distributed across supply chains, production schedules, cost estimates, and regulatory filings. The foreman who joked about mosquitoes did not know that phosgene caused delayed pulmonary edema. The plant manager who rejected the installation of gas detectors did so because detectors were expensive and the budget was tight. The corporate executive who signed the shipping manifest did not visit the factory floor. The system functioned as designed. It produced dyes, plastics, rubber, insecticides, and automotive upholstery. It also produced a steady, quiet stream of men with fluid in their lungs, but the system did not count those men as products. They were externalities, a term that economists had begun to use to describe costs that businesses did not have to pay. By the late 1920s, phosgene was no longer just a chemical on the industrial periphery. It had slipped deep into the infrastructure of everyday life, including the refrigeration systems of modern municipal buildings. On May 15, 1929, that silent presence reached Euclid Avenue. The Cleveland Clinic's main building rose 6 stories above Euclid Avenue, a monument to modern medicine in pale Indiana limestone. It was May 15, 1929, a Wednesday, and the hospital was full with the ordinary traffic of human frailty. A man recovering from gallbladder surgery, a woman in the maternity ward holding her newborn, a young nurse counting morphine ampules in a locked cabinet. The basement held the X-ray department, where nitrocellulose film was stored on wooden shelving, and the basement also held the refrigeration plant. The clinic had installed an ice-making system years earlier because modern medicine required cold. The refrigerant was methyl chloride, colorless, slightly sweet, heavier than air, and entirely unremarkable unless you subjected it to extreme heat, at which point its molecular structure rearranged itself into phosgene. At 11:30 a.m., a steam fitter named James Wills was repairing a pipe in the basement. His acetylene torch touched a valve, and a small fire started near the X-ray film storage. Nitrocellulose, once ignited, does not smolder. It detonates into flame, and it produces its own oxygen as it burns, meaning there is no smothering it. The fire spread through the basement in under 2 minutes. It found the refrigeration lines. Methyl chloride, heated beyond roughly 400 degrees Celsius, undergoes thermal decomposition. The chlorine atoms and its structure rearrange in the presence of oxygen and carbon monoxide, forming carbonyl chloride, phosgene. Each molecule, once inhaled, begins the slow cascade of damage that the victim cannot feel for hours. The gas rose through the building. It followed the stairwells and elevator shafts because phosgene is heavier than air, which is heavier than smoke, which meant it traveled ahead of the visible fire, pooling in the upper floors before anyone knew the basement was burning. On the 3rd floor, a nurse named Virginia Halloran noticed a smell she later described as fresh-cut hay, but wrong somehow, as if the meadow had been sealed in a jar for 20 years and then uncapped in a hospital corridor. The fire department arrived at 11:38 a.m. The scene looked almost manageable, smoke pouring from basement windows, patients being led out through the main doors, some in wheelchairs, some walking. Firefighters began running hoses into the basement stairwell. Thomas O'Leary, a lieutenant with 11 years on the job, was the first to notice the smell. He had grown up on a dairy farm outside Youngstown, and he knew what fresh hay smelled like, the sweet, green, slightly cloying odor of a barn in late June. He stood on the sidewalk in his heavy canvas coat and tried to reconcile that smell with the acrid diesel exhaust of the fire engines. It did not fit. He mentioned it to his captain. "It smells like someone's cutting hay down the street." The captain nodded and told him to check the hose pressure. By 12:15 p.m., the fire was under control. The last patients were outside, standing on the lawn in hospital gowns and blankets, shivering despite the warm May sun. Some of them were coughing, but people always cough after a fire. The Red Cross set up a triage station. Ambulances took the visibly injured to nearby hospitals. The fire itself had killed 123 people. But the fire itself was not the primary killer. By 3:00 p.m., the first survivors began to collapse. A nurse who had walked out of the building under her own power suddenly could not breathe. A firefighter who had been drinking coffee on the running board of the engine began coughing up a pink, frothy fluid. A patient waiting for transport slid off his chair in the triage tent, his lips turning gray, his eyes open and confused. The delayed pulmonary edema had begun. Dr. John Phillips, the clinic's chief of medicine, spent the morning coordinating the evacuation. By evening, he was coordinating something else, a growing realization that the survivors were dying in a pattern that made no sense. He called a colleague at Lakeside Hospital and described the symptoms. The colleague asked about the refrigeration plant. The methyl chloride had decomposed into phosgene at a concentration that no one could calculate until weeks later. The gas had filled the stairwells, the corridors, the patient rooms, the operating theaters. Every space the evacuation had passed through. Everyone who had been in the building for more than a few minutes had inhaled some quantity of phosgene. The Cleveland Clinic fire was the first mass casualty phosgene event on American soil. It happened not in a chemical plant, not in a munitions factory, not in a laboratory, but in a hospital. The building where people went to be saved. The newspaper coverage in the days that followed focused on the heroism of the nurses, the tragedy of the victims, the questions about why nitrocellulose film had been stored without fire suppression. Phosgene was mentioned, usually in passing, as a toxic fume or chemical byproduct. The word appeared in exactly one headline, in the Cleveland Plain Dealer on May 17, buried below the fold. The public had no framework for understanding what had happened. Chemical weapons were a European memory, a dark story from a dark continent, not something that could rise through the ventilation system of a modern American hospital. But the firefighters remembered. Thomas O'Leary spent the rest of his career asking questions about what other household chemicals might decompose into poisons when heated. He became one of the first American fire service instructors to teach a formal course on chemical hazard identification. The curriculum was primitive, a list of common refrigerants, the temperatures at which they broke down, the gases they produced. But it was a beginning. The Cleveland Clinic disaster forced American fire departments to acknowledge that the chemistry of everyday life had outstripped their training. Deepwater, New Jersey, noon, summer of 1932. The sun is high and the air smells of industrial chemistry, ammonia, coal tar, hot metal, and underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the scent of new mown hay. The men are finishing their sandwiches. Harold Krieger is telling the mosquito joke again. The phosgene storage tank looms behind him, green paint flaking, rust spreading, a faint wisp of vapor visible at the relief valve. No one looks up. The men finish their coffee, stub out their cigarettes, and walk back into the reactor building. They will finish their shift at 6. Some of them will wake up at 2 in the morning and find themselves drowning in air. The death certificate will say bronchitis. The factory will open again tomorrow. The story of phosgene in the 1920s and 1930s is not a story of criminal conspiracy. It is a story of legal production, standard accounting, and the quiet assumption that civilian chemistry was innocent by definition. The treaties had banned the gas from the battlefield, and the treaties had been honored. No nation used phosgene against enemy soldiers in the years between the wars. But the gas itself did not disappear. It migrated. It moved from the artillery shell to the automobile seat, from the trench to the cornfield, from the military hospital to the company clinic. It kept its pleasant smell and its delayed mechanism of injury. It kept killing people who did not know they had been exposed. And it was, at that very moment, settling into a technology that millions of Americans would soon trust with their lives. A technology so ordinary, so domestic, so essential to modern life, that no one had thought to ask what the factory that produced it was doing to the men who ran the machines. The film reel sits on a metal shelf in the National Archives, cataloged as Training Film 8-142 United States Army Chemical Corps, 1942. It is 19 minutes long, black and white. It opens with a title card that reads, In block letters, identification of Phosgene by odor. The letters are slightly crooked, a small flaw that no one bothered to fix because the film was needed quickly and the men who would watch it would not be judging the typography. The first shot shows a concrete chamber somewhere in Edgewood, Maryland, where the Army had built its chemical warfare school on marshland that flooded every spring. The chamber is painted white, lit by harsh overhead bulbs, and furnished with nothing but a row of wooden benches. On those benches sit 12 soldiers, all of them young, all wearing M1 service masks with the voice diaphragms that made them look like they were speaking through insect mouths. They are watching a sergeant who holds a small glass ampule between his thumb and forefinger. The ampule is no larger than a fountain pen cartridge. Inside, it is a quantity of phosgene gas, concentrated enough to give 12 men an education and not enough to kill them, provided the ventilation fans are running at full power. The film does not mention that this dosage math had been worked out on goats and rats before it was applied to 18-year-old draftees from Ohio and Tennessee. The sergeant breaks the ampule. The camera cannot see the gas. It can only see the soldiers, who stiffen slightly as the odor reaches them. One man tilts his head, the way someone might tilt their head upon hearing distant music they cannot quite identify. Another raises his hand to his mask, adjusting the seal, a nervous gesture that the narrator will later describe as proper safety discipline, but which looks like the reflexive motion of a man whose body knows something his conscious mind is still processing. The smell fills the chamber. Faint, familiar. The smell of a barn on a July afternoon, of cut alfalfa drying in windrows. The training manual calls it characteristic. It does not call it pleasant. It does not call it dangerous. It simply says that a soldier who detects this odor should put on his mask immediately. The film cuts to a close-up of the ampule in the sergeant's hand. The narration says, in the clipped voice the Army used for all its training films, "You will remember this smell for the rest of your life." And then a corporal in the front row laughs through his mask and says something the microphone does not quite catch, something the director decided to leave in the final cut because it broke the tension. What the corporal said, according to notes later collected by the Army's Oral History Unit, was, "Reminds me of my grandfather's farm." The camera holds on his eyes. Behind the glass lenses of the M1 mask, they are smiling. This was the American system at full speed in 1942. The Chemical Corps built gas chambers in every major training camp. They manufactured thousands of glass ampules, each one a tiny sealed world of hay-scented danger. They ran tens of thousands of men through the identification drills, break the ampule, smell the hay, put on the mask, until it became as automatic as loading a rifle. At the Monsanto plant in St. Louis, the same gas arrived in tank cars, was piped into storage spheres, and was fed into reactors that polymerized it into the precursor chemicals for polyurethane foam. The workers who tended those reactors were not soldiers. They had received no training in chemical warfare. They did not carry gas masks. They did not know what phosgene smelled like, or they knew but had learned to ignore it because the smell was always present, a permanent background note in the air of the production floor, like the smell of oil in a garage. When a valve leaked, they tightened it. When the hay smell grew stronger, they opened a window and kept working. In 1943, a proposal reached the desk of the War Production Board. The proposal was simple: require all civilian workers in phosgene handling facilities to wear toxic gas detection badges small paper squares treated with chemicals that would change color in the presence of the gas. The badges were cheap, the technology was proven, the cost per worker was less than the cost of a single day's wages. The War Production Board rejected the proposal. The reasoning, preserved in a memorandum dated August 17, 1943, was that requiring civilian workers to wear gas detection badges would create unnecessary alarm among factory communities. Workers might ask questions. They might tell their families. They might look at the badge, see that it had changed color, and understand that they had been breathing something that the government had spent millions of dollars teaching soldiers to fear. They might slow down production. And production, the memorandum concluded, remains the paramount consideration at this stage of the war effort. The memorandum was filed and forgotten. The Monsanto workers continued to tighten the valves. The DuPont workers in Buffalo continued to unload the tank cars. No one told them that the Army was training soldiers a few miles away to recognize that smell and flee from it. The two worlds, the gas mask and the assembly line, remained administratively separate, even when they were geographically adjacent, separated not by distance, but by the category labels on government forms. One more piece of paperwork, buried in the same archive as the training film, records a small incident at the Richmond plant in May 1944. A worker named Arthur Coleman, age 42, father of 3, collapsed during his shift and was carried to the plant infirmary. The plant doctor found fluid in his lungs, a pink froth that bubbled up when he coughed. The doctor wrote bronchitis on the intake form. He did not write phosgene poisoning, because phosgene poisoning was a military diagnosis, a thing that happened to soldiers in gas attacks, not to civilians in American factories. Coleman was sent home. He returned to work 3 days later. He died of respiratory failure in 1949, 5 years after the war ended, at the age of 47. His death certificate listed the cause as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The plant kept operating. The war ended. The factories that had made phosgene for tank seats and bomber windows did not shut down. They converted, with the fluid ease of an industry that served both war and peace, to making the materials of the post-war American dream. Polyurethane foam for sofa cushions, polycarbonate for car dashboards, synthetic rubber for garden hoses. The workers who handled it still did not wear badges. They still did not carry masks. They tightened the valves and wiped down the pipes and told themselves, because no one had told them otherwise, that the smell of hay was nothing more than the smell of honest work. 30 years later, the tank car sat on a rusty siding just outside Sturgeon, Pennsylvania, a town of fewer than 900 people tucked into the folded hills of the state's southwestern industrial corridor. It was early afternoon on a Tuesday in March 1976, and a single yellow gasket on the car's outlet valve had been quietly failing for hours. The vapor that escaped was invisible against the gray sky, and the only warning it gave was the faint smell of freshly cut hay drifting across the rail yard, past a lunch pail left on the gravel, past the open window of a dispatcher's office. The placard that should have identified the cargo was partially torn and smeared with road grime, the word poison facing inward toward the metal skin of the tank. The leak went unreported until a worker collapsed near the siding at 3:10 p.m., coughing pink foam into his sleeve. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. By nightfall, 17 more people had been hospitalized with burning chests and a wet, rattling breath that doctors initially diagnosed as a fast-moving respiratory infection. It took 3 days for OSHA to confirm that phosgene was involved. The investigators interviewed railroad employees who described a sweet odor they had noticed for weeks whenever that particular car moved through the yard, a smell they had come to associate with nothing more dangerous than a grass-cutting crew beyond the fence. One man told the investigators he had actually liked the smell. It reminded him of his grandfather's farm. The OSHA report read like a quiet indictment. Phosgene was moving through American towns in rail cars that carried no detection systems, no automatic alarms, and no telemetry. The cars were not required to be tracked by local emergency response agencies. The workers had received no training in recognizing phosgene exposure, had access to no gas masks, and had never been told that the hay smell was anything other than an innocuous curiosity. One paragraph noted that the tank car's owner had complied with all existing labeling regulations, and that those regulations had simply been inadequate to prevent a placard from becoming illegible during routine transit. The United States had fought a world war against tyranny, built a regulatory state to protect its own citizens, and spent billions on occupational health legislation. Yet a chemical that could kill with a single deep breath was still being shipped through communities in containers that were effectively unmarked. The permissible exposure limit existed on paper, a number in the Federal Register, while the actual concentration of phosgene in the lungs of a dispatcher in Sturgeon had never been measured by anyone, ever. The permissible had separated from the actual, and the distance between those two words was filled by the silent, pleasant smell of hay. For the 17 workers who survived Sturgeon and were discharged over the following weeks, the immediate fear receded. Their chest X-rays cleared. The company paid their medical bills. They told themselves they had been lucky. They returned to work. But phosgene had a way of revealing itself slowly, on a timescale that had nothing to do with hospital discharge dates or cleared X-rays. Some of those 17 men would develop chronic obstructive pulmonary disease years earlier than their unexposed counterparts. A few would die of respiratory failure in their 60s, their death certificates listing emphysema or bronchitis, the word phosgene nowhere to be found. The gas kept its own silent accounting, and the body paid the balance over decades, not days. The split rail fence between the Union Carbide plant and the middle school had been there so long that no one remembered who built it, whether the company had put it up as a gesture of neighborly boundary, or the county had demanded it. Or some forgotten superintendent had decided that a line of unpainted locust wood was enough to separate chlorine gas from children. By 1985, the wood had bleached to a silvery gray, and in certain morning lights the fence threw a shadow that reached halfway across the soccer field, a long dark stripe that moved with the sun and disappeared around noon, right about the time the air began to smell of fresh-cut hay. The school had been there since 1962, the plant since 1940. The town of Institute, West Virginia, took its name from the historically black land-grant college founded on those grounds in 1891. The chemical plant arrived during the Second World War, part of the mobilization that turned the Kanawha River Valley into a corridor of reactors and storage tanks stretching from Charleston to the hills. Union Carbide had built the Institute plant to manufacture phosgene-based intermediates, the invisible precursors to synthetic rubber, polyurethane foam, and later methyl isocyanate, the same methyl isocyanate that would kill thousands in Bhopal, India, in December 1984, in the worst industrial disaster in history. The people of Institute knew about Bhopal. They had watched the footage on the evening news, the bodies in the streets, the Union Carbide spokesman reading a statement while the death toll climbed past 2,000. And many of them had walked to their own fences, looked at the pipes and tanks 400 yards from their front porches, and asked the same question: what exactly is in there? The company said the plant was safe. The emissions were negligible. The haze smell was just a process odor, nothing more. But in 1985, the Environmental Protection Agency began prying open the records. What they found was a catalog of routine releases that violated nearly every permit the plant had ever held. Phosgene, methyl isocyanate, chlorine, hydrogen chloride. The gases had been vented, flared, or simply leaked into the air of the Kanawha Valley dozens of times a year for 4 decades. 28 releases of methyl isocyanate alone between 1980 and 1984, none of which had been reported to the community. The plant's own monitoring data showed phosgene concentrations at the fence line, sometimes exceeding the federal permissible exposure limit for a factory floor. But the readings were filed in internal reports that no one outside the company ever saw. A community health study in 1987 tried to quantify what the lungs of Institute already knew. Researchers examined hospital records and surveyed residents within a 1-mile radius of the plant. The numbers were stark. Chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and asthma occurred at rates nearly 3 times the national average. The rates were higher still among people who had lived within the 1-mile zone for more than 10 years. Children who grew up playing soccer on that field beside the fence were hospitalized for respiratory infections more often than children in towns 20 miles upriver. The study's authors wrote their conclusions in careful academic language, statistically significant association, but the meaning was plain enough. The haze smell was not benign. It never had been. Union Carbide responded the way chemical companies had been responding for 100 years. The study was attacked as methodologically flawed. The company's own consultants produced a counter-analysis that found no excess disease. By the simple expedient of comparing Institute to other heavily industrialized towns rather than to the national average, a statistical maneuver that asked whether the residents were sicker than people who also breathed industrial chemicals, rather than asking whether they were sicker than people who breathed clean air. The finding of no significant difference was technically true within that narrow frame, and technically useless as a measure of harm. That was the year the law changed, or seemed to. In 1986, Congress passed the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, born in part from the shock of Bhopal and in part from years of organizing in places like Institute. The law required companies to disclose their chemical inventories and report their releases. For the first time, the data poured into public view. The toxics release inventory showed that the Institute plant had released more than 100,000 pounds of phosgene, methyl isocyanate, and related compounds into the air, water, and soil in a single year. The residents of Institute could now read the name of the chemical in a government database. They could learn the lethal concentration, the delayed pulmonary edema, the way the gas acylated the proteins in the lung membrane. But knowing did not create a mechanism for protection. The law required reporting, not reduction. The chemical was perfectly legal to release in sublethal doses, and the Right to Know Act had not been written with the authority to cap emissions or revoke permits. The plant's lawyers understood this immediately. The disclosures continued year after year, the numbers posted on the EPA's public website like a ledger of chronic insult. 1992, 15,000 pounds of toxic releases. 1995, 12,700. 1998, 9,450. The trend was downward because new scrubbers were installed when regulations tightened. But less is not the same as none, and phosgene below the acute exposure threshold is still phosgene moving through the lungs of a community year after year, in doses too small to trigger an alarm but large enough over time to remodel the delicate architecture of the alveolar membrane. The paradox of Institute is that it was not exceptional. The Kanawha Valley was one of dozens of chemical corridors where the logic of industrial production had settled beside the logic of human settlement, and the two had come to an accommodation built on paperwork and monitoring wells. Every worker who clocked in at the plant was contributing to a supply chain that touched almost every product of modern life, and every resident who breathed the fence-line air was paying the uncharged cost of that production with the tissue of their lungs. The story of phosgene could have ended there. A slow, quiet tragedy of industrial poisoning, buried in EPA reports. The hay smell fading into the background of a West Virginia valley. But in the early years of the 21st century, an unexpected discovery forced a different kind of reckoning. It came not from a factory fence line or a government database, but from a file that had been resting in a box in the National Archives since 1929. In the fluorescent hush of the National Archives reading room, the document arrives in a box that has not been opened since the Truman administration. Inside, a manila folder holds 23 sheets of paper typed on a Royal typewriter in 1927. The paper is brittle at the edges, but the numbers are still legible. The file is classified under Chemical Warfare Service, Medical Division, Long-Term Studies, but the classification is a formality. No one has requested it in 80 years. What the file contains is a study conducted by British physicians at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Netley, where thousands of gas casualties had been treated during the war, and where, a decade after the armistice, a surprising number of them were still dying. The researchers had tracked 3,000 veterans with documented phosgene exposure, men who had inhaled the gas at Ypres, at the Somme, at Passchendaele, men who had walked away from the front lines, men who had been listed as recovered in their military medical records. The study followed them into civilian life, into their 30s and 40s, into the tuberculosis sanatoria and the respiratory wards where they were admitted year after year. The numbers were unambiguous. The phosgene-exposed veterans were dying of chronic lung disease at rates 40% higher than the general population. That figure included men who had never shown acute symptoms during the war, men who had inhaled the hay-scented air, felt nothing worse than a tickle in the throat, and returned to their posts. A decade later, their lung tissue was stiffening, their airways narrowing, their immune systems appearing to turn against their own pulmonary architecture. The study ended with a recommendation. The physicians urged the British War Office to fund further research into what they called the chronic sequelae of phosgene intoxication, the long-term consequences, the cellular remodeling, the immune system effects that no one had thought to look for in 1918. They suggested that the same mechanisms might be at work in industrial workers. They asked for money to continue the investigation. The War Office forwarded the study to the United States Army Chemical Warfare Service in the spring of 1928. Someone wrote a memorandum summarizing the findings. Someone else stamped it, received, Medical Division. And then someone, a colonel, a clerk, a forgotten administrator whose name has disappeared from the record, wrote a single sentence in the margin of the cover page in handwriting that has faded to pale sepia. Recommend follow-up, no funds available. The file was placed in a folder and moved to a warehouse, then to an archive, then to a newer building in Maryland, where the fluorescent lights hummed over rows of boxes that no one ever requested. The British study and the recommendation it contained simply ceased to exist as actionable knowledge. It became a latent fact, a truth that had been recorded but not distributed, a warning that had been spoken but not heard. The reason was not malice. It was something more troubling. By 1928, the Army Chemical Warfare Service was already shifting its attention to newer weapons. Mustard gas had claimed the public imagination. Lewisite was being tested with enthusiasm. The next war, the logic ran, would be fought with weapons more terrible than the last, and there was no budget for studying the slow deaths of veterans from a gas that everyone had agreed to stop using. And so, the evidence was filed away. The 3,000 men in the study died, one by one, their deaths recorded as bronchitis, emphysema, pneumonia, natural causes. The industrial workers who handled Phosgene in the 1930s and 1940s breathed the hay-scented air in factories that had never been told about the study. The regulators who could have set safer exposure limits had never heard the recommendation. The knowledge existed, but it was locked in a box, and the box had no window. In the first decade of the 21st century, researchers finally began to confirm what the British physicians had suspected. Studies of industrial workers in Germany, Japan, and the United States demonstrated that even low-level phosgene exposure produced measurable changes in lung function over time. The alveolar walls thickened. The risk of fibrosis, of emphysema, of autoimmune lung disease increased with cumulative exposure, and there appeared to be no threshold below which exposure was entirely safe. The body remembered the insult even when the mind had never registered it. The Centers for Disease Control acknowledged in a 2018 report that the delayed effects of phosgene exposure remain poorly understood. The report noted that no comprehensive long-term study of industrial phosgene workers had ever been conducted in the United States. The data simply did not exist. The study that might have launched such an investigation had been recommended in 1928 and never funded, and in the 90 years since, no one had filled the gap. The fluorescent lights in the reading room flicker as the box is closed. The paper returns to the darkness. The handwritten note, "Recommend follow-up. No funds available," disappears beneath the manila flap. Outside, cars move along the highway, their interiors filled with polyurethane foam, their dashboards molded from polycarbonate, their engines running on fuel that was refined with chemicals that required phosgene somewhere in the supply chain. The gas is still being manufactured, still being shipped, still being inhaled at low levels by workers who have never heard of the Netley study, by residents who have never been told what the hay smell means. The archive holds the knowledge, but the archive does not distribute it. The file is present and absent at the same time, a fact that exists but does not act, a warning that has been recorded but not delivered. The recommendation that was buried in a cardboard box in 1928 can now be found in any hardware store in the country. The fluorescent lights of the home improvement store are calibrated to make everything look clean and possible. Aisle 17, insulation and sealants. A man in a red vest is restocking canisters of polyurethane spray foam. The labels are bright orange and navy blue, promising triple expanding gap filler and easy home improvement. A woman picks up a canister, reads the back where the instructions explain in 6-point type that the foam cures to a rigid finish in under an hour, and drops it into her cart alongside a paint roller and a pack of utility blades. She does not think about chemistry. She thinks about the draft in her daughter's bedroom and the winter heating bill. Somewhere else, 1,400 miles southwest, a low greenish haze hangs above a cooling tower in the chemical corridor of the Texas Gulf Coast. The air smells faintly of cut grass, even though it is December and the fields around the plant are brown and dormant. Inside the facility, methylene diphenyl diisocyanate is being synthesized in a reactor the size of a locomotive, and Phosgene is the knife that makes the cut. It flows through jacketed pipes at 20 degrees below its boiling point, a liquid that turns to vapor the instant it finds open air. Workers in the control room track pressures on screens that refresh once per second. If a flange fails, the first warning will be the smell, fresh hay, sweet and nostalgic, and by then, the exposure will already have begun its silent accounting inside the lungs of anyone downwind. As of 2025, the United States produces approximately 1.2 million tons of Phosgene annually for industrial purposes. That number does not include the Phosgene generated and consumed immediately on site, the intermediate material that never appears on a shipping manifest. The bulk of it goes into the two polymers that hold together a great deal of modern American life: polyurethane foam and polycarbonate plastic. The foam cushions the seats of every passenger vehicle manufactured in North America, insulates the walls of suburban houses, pads the soles of athletic shoes, and lines the interior of refrigerators in millions of kitchens. The polycarbonate becomes the transparent shell of headlight lenses, the shatter-resistant panels of greenhouses, the housings of medical devices, the casings of laptops. Phosgene is the invisible rivet in the consumer landscape, and it has been for so long that the rivet has become indistinguishable from the thing it holds together. The international legal framework reflects this double life with uncomfortable clarity. The United Nations Chemical Weapons Convention of 1997 prohibits the use of Phosgene as a method of warfare. It is listed in Schedule 3, the lowest tier of restricted chemicals, dangerous enough to be recorded, useful enough to be protected. The treaty explicitly permits its manufacture for industrial, agricultural, medical, or other peaceful purposes. A factory that produces Phosgene for polyurethane is legally no different from a factory that produces steam for a textile mill. The reporting requirements are minimal. In the 28 years since the convention entered into force, no challenge inspection has ever been conducted at a Phosgene-consuming plant on American soil. The domestic regulation is even looser. There is no specific federal statute requiring Phosgene detection or alarm systems in production facilities. OSHA sets a permissible exposure limit of 0.1 parts per million over an 8-hour time weighted average, but that number is enforced only after an incident. The EPA's risk management program requires facilities to prepare worst-case release scenarios and coordinate with local emergency planning committees. Critics have described these requirements as the honor system with extra filing cabinets. A 2021 investigation by the Chemical Safety Board found that of the 53 major Phosgene handling facilities it reviewed, fewer than half had optical remote sensing equipment capable of detecting a release at the fence line. The rest relied on passive monitoring. A worker notices the smell. A worker feels a tickle in the throat. A worker radios the control room and hopes the wind is blowing toward the retention pond rather than the elementary school. The human detection system is a fragile instrument. Phosgene's odor threshold is approximately 0.4 parts per million, 4 times the legal exposure limit, which means that by the time a worker smells fresh hay, they have already inhaled a concentration sufficient to cause subclinical damage. The olfactory receptor that binds phosgene adapts rapidly. After a few minutes of continuous exposure, the scent fades, and the brain registers the air as clean. The worker removes their respirator because everything seems normal, and the gas continues its work undetected. Treatment in 2025 is essentially identical to treatment in 1915. Oxygen is administered. Corticosteroids are injected to suppress the immune response. The patient is placed on a ventilator if the edema becomes severe, and the clinical team does what the clinical team has always done: they wait. There is no specific antidote. There is no compound that uncross-links the damaged proteins or restores the membrane's integrity. The lung heals if it heals, and if it does not heal, the survivor carries a permanently remodeled pulmonary architecture into the remaining decades of their life. 100,000 American workers handle phosgene directly in the course of their employment. That is the estimate published by NIOSH in its most recent survey, though the number is likely an undercount because it does not include contract laborers who clean reactors during shutdowns, rail workers who move tank cars through classification yards, warehouse employees who store drums of isocyanates in unventilated sheds, or firefighters who respond when something goes wrong. Millions more live within a 1-mile radius of the plants, the warehouses, and the rail corridors. For almost all of them, the only available detection technology is the olfactory epithelium and the memory of a smell that most people associate with a pleasant summer afternoon. The paradox is not that phosgene is unknown. It is one of the most thoroughly studied poisons in industrial chemistry. Its toxicokinetics have been mapped, its mechanism described in textbooks, its epidemiological fingerprints documented across 11 decades. The knowledge is complete. The paradox is that the knowledge has not produced a different outcome. The factories remain. The tank cars remain. The production volumes increase year after year because the global appetite for polyurethane foam and polycarbonate plastic increases year after year. The alternatives exist: dimethylcarbonate, triphosgene, non-phosgene routes to isocyanates, but they are more expensive. A phosgene-free supply chain would require capital investment estimated in the tens of billions of dollars, higher retail prices for consumer goods, and an acknowledgement that the convenience we have built into our physical world rests on a foundation we would prefer not to examine. The woman from the home improvement store is home now. She has applied the spray foam around the window frame in her daughter's bedroom. The foam has expanded, cured, and sealed the gap. The room is warmer than it was the night before. She runs her hand over the dried foam, feels the rigid, closed cell texture, and switches off the light. In the dark, the foam continues to exist, a molecular architecture born from phosgene, stable and inert, and quietly holding back the cold. The gas that made it possible has long since been consumed, but the gas that will make the next batch is already being synthesized 1,000 miles away, in a reactor where the shift supervisor is checking a pressure gauge and catching a faint, sweet odor that reminds him of the hayfield behind his grandfather's barn. The archive does not conclude. It accumulates. The file containing the 1927 British study, the study that found excess chronic lung disease and recommended long-term monitoring, the study that was stamped, recommend follow-up. No funds available and interred in a cardboard box for 80 years. That file now sits beside the 2023 NIOSH survey, that found elevated respiratory mortality in the same chemical corridor where Phosgene has been produced since 1940. The two documents say the same thing, separated by nearly a century of unheeded warnings. The question the archive poses is not whether Phosgene is safe. The question is quieter and more uncomfortable. What does it mean that we have chosen to live with it anyway? What will be written in the margin of the file that someone opens 100 years from now, when they discover that we possessed all the evidence we needed, and we possessed the technical capacity to change course, and we simply decided, line item by line item, that the cost of protecting human lungs was not quite worth the price of remaking the world we had grown used to sleeping on. What was found below was not a secret. It was a file. Box 247, Record Group 175, a cardboard container in a climate-controlled warehouse, stamped with a handwritten note from 1928, recommend follow-up, no funds available. Inside lay the evidence that 3,000 British veterans had donated their lungs to science without knowing it, and that the science had been shelved before it could warn anyone else. The truth that became visible was not that Phosgene killed in the trenches. That had always been known. The truth was that the gas kept killing long after the cloud dispersed. Men who smelled hay and walked away carried a hidden price in the architecture of their lungs, and the invoice came due decades later in the form of fibrosis, emphysema, and a death certificate that never mentioned the word Phosgene. The same molecule that colored the trousers of American farmers and cushioned the seats of their automobiles also acylated the proteins of an alveolar membrane with a patience that outlasted any single generation of workers. The pink froth that filled the lungs of a soldier in 1915 was chemically identical to the fluid that rose in the throat of a rail yard worker in Sturgeon in 1976, and both were the same substance that John Davy first described as pleasant in 1812. The evidence changed nothing. That is what the archive teaches. The file was not lost. It was simply not funded. And the work of the gas continued, unregulated by knowledge, because knowledge without the will to act is just another document gathering dust. Now the pressure eases from the hull. The darkness above thins into a blue that widens with each fathom. The hatch opens, and the light of the surface spills in cold and clean. The evidence we recovered from the deep does not require us to remake the world all at once. It only asks us to hear the smell of fresh hay differently, to understand that it is not a memory of safety, but a record of a choice we are still making. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The file is closed, but the hay smell drifts on, and now we know what it carries.